Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I just wanted to quickly introduce my relative, Vanessa Campbell, who will provide a welcome on behalf of Musqueam, and then we'll start our proceedings.
Did we go? CMCA, Netlhuelmo. Vanessa Quinisqui, Tanitzanet Mathwiam. I Tanash Qualwin, Quins E. Quitsnala. Nitzan Kilton, Nasia, Quins Hunt Caminum Can. Sasu to I queth Qualwin. Quenya A Tish the Heems the Siawanist. That to Mathwiam Squamich. It is a little with hot mistake. Sleeks, hilak stala, tamakwalap. Amid sab awel taswalap ait mistake. Queth hami tanawel. Ni hihaslamet tanatamo, tanaka, with cletus yais makswell. Tlachte quith yais awatab uquiwaslap. Haitap kataswalap. When ewan awis quith no wayel. Katyo. Good morning, everybody. My name is Vanessa Campbell, and I'm from Musqueam. And it's my honor to join you all here today on behalf of my elders and my community to welcome you to the shared territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I was asked to speak to you in Hunt Caminum to welcome you, but also to help ground your minds and your hearts in a good place. Our people are taught from a young age the importance of our waterways, and they're really the hub of who we are. More than a place that provides food and sustenance, they're a place of ever-changing learning and connecting with culture. And these teachings, they remind us that we have a responsibility to care for our waters and to be true stewards. And stewardship built on historical knowledge and values of our ancestors is what will help guide us through our day today. I want to raise my hands to the Aura Gallery, to Emily Carr, and to all the organizers, but also to each and every one of you who are here today. It's your continued learning and our discussions here today that are integral to the reimagining of relationships with these waters. So,
hello, good morning. I am Denise Runner of Or Gallery, and wanted to follow up with an introduction to today, but also, of course, some important notes. So today's event and panels will be streamed live, but also recorded and posted. So just wanted to make you aware of that. Washrooms are outside, and just follow the signs to your right. And then also for speakers and participants, and there's a green room upstairs in the Rennie Hall with refreshments and pastries and whatnot. And I also wanted to invite everyone here at the end of our event tomorrow at 8 p.m. at Or Gallery, a kind of wrap-up party So feel free to stop by tomorrow after 8 for a last chance to meet some people that are returning home and or maybe meet new people that live here. So again, thank you, Vanessa, for welcome and welcoming us as guests, or at least myself as a guest on this land. And so just to not cut in too much to the amazing panel that Jordan's line up next, I just wanted to share that Unmoored, Adrift, and Ashore was known as the water thing while we were developing it over the past year and a half. And these conversations started in response to publications and reports that were circulating on predicted flooding patterns due to sea level rise that would redraw the map and shoreline of this city. As a curator, I've always been attuned to and often worked from the influence and agency held by place. So when it was predicted that Emily Carr University of Art and Design would be one of the submerged sites and reclaimed by the ocean in possibly just a few decades, it seemed like the place to invite people to gather and think about not what should be done to stop the ocean from reclaiming shoreline and floodplains, but to think about what can be undone and what is undone when water returns and submerges. I invited frequent thinking partners, collaborators, and friends, and some Franca, Jordan Wilson, and Jamie Hilder to bring their diverse and divergent approaches to oceanic studies. Jamie will try to say that he's just the co-signer on the grant as the guy with the university letterhead or the office upstairs, but he's been important to helping to shape and push forward this project throughout the process, as well as mentoring our project assistants who I hope to be able to introduce when they're all here later today. And as well as a small gallery director, I know how important the grant writing is and some of that invisible work. And Jamie's also done a lot of that behind the scenes. So thank you very much. It's more than just co-signing a grant. And again, I wanted to also thank our gallery staff, our project assistants, Zoe, Katrina, Reiko, and Lucas. I hope they will introduce themselves. Lucas is just working today, so maybe when they're all here. And also our tech, Alex Mir, upstairs, or at the top there. Before inviting Ansem and Jordan up to continue the introductions to this couple of days, I wanted to, again, wholeheartedly thank all of the speakers and respondents who have taken time out of their very busy schedules and lives to join us, both here on site and remotely. It's a hybrid event. I know, especially during this pandemic, that time is some other sort of concept that's elusive, and similarly the headspace to do the quiet thinking and research that a lot of our brilliant speakers and respondents need is also scarce. So I really am grateful that they've taken the time to join us over these few days. And with that, I will invite Ansem up to say a few words.
Thank you, Denise. Asked me to add a few words, which I'll humbly do. Also want to express my gratitude for the hospitality and being received as a guest here. I want to express my gratitude to all of you who have followed our invitations from near and far and spent these days together. And just a few thoughts I noted this morning. I don't probably have to tell you that we are in a moment of extreme danger where the rule of property and profit is ready to rather destroy the common earth than allow itself to be abolished. And I think we harbor no illusions about that. But these are also times of rejuvenation and collective assertion that a different life is possible and has never been subdued. And I think that's the spirit that shall animate our gathering today. I'm very thankful to Jordan Wilson, for having us, for taking us yesterday to his community, where I think this was powerfully, transformatively felt. I want to thank Jamie Hilder for the many conversations on screen and the collaboration. And I want to especially thank Denise. For me, this is a colleague and friend, and this is also for me an opportunity together with all of you to celebrate her work of the past few years at our gallery and the community she helped nurture. And for this reason also, I'm very glad to be here. I think of water as the actualizing spirit of this earth and of perhaps the perpetual dawn of everything, or in Sylvia Wynter's words, at the counter-cosmogonic, our counter-cosmogonic origin story. And when we speak to water, with water, from water, about the ocean, rivers, shorelines, I think we acknowledge that we are ourselves on perpetually shifting grounds, and water, I think, also helps us to think some of the conundrums of being in education, of being in institutions, of knowing of the dangers of systemic reproduction, that such ways of talking and contain and reproduce, and that water is a guide in that, since it helps us to undo and remake fixed categories. It's a medium of thought and an archive in which nothing ever is lost. Like my friend Ho Tsun-Yen phrased this very beautiful line for that, like water in water. I think, therefore, as a guiding principle for how to think of this conversation between the arts also in different disciplines, like in these 2 days, beyond the horizon and below the categories and value forms of the colonial modern. In this spirit, I invite you to join us here to follow the waterways, unmoored, adrift, ashore. Thank you.
So we'll start off our first session of the morning. When I want to go fishing, the 2 parties are also holding on to each end of my boat. There are initials and numbers on the bow and initials and numbers on the stern, and I know that I own the water. That is the grievance that I want to bring before the commissioners. I don't want to have a license to do anything. When I want to catch fish for my living, I don't want to be interfered with at all. These words, spoken by Chief Johnny Huayaluk in 1913, have stuck with me since I encountered them over a decade ago as an undergraduate student. They were spoken at the McKenna McBride Commission hearing held on the Musqueam Reserve, where many of us gathered yesterday. The commission was meant to solve the Indian land question in British Columbia, ultimately expropriating valuable tracts of land from reserves while adding less valuable lands. To my mind, this excerpt from Chief Johnny Huayaluk's testimony speaks to the tension between what we know to be true and its denial by settler governments and society. This is a tension that still exists and shapes our realities in relationship to our lands and waters, and one which our panelists will provide insight to. My intention with this opening session is to orient both our visiting speakers and symposium audience to local issues and histories, both specific here on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, but also this region commonly referred to as the Pacific Northwest Coast. While our respective nations have distinct histories, cultures, and territories, we also share connections and commonalities, which are often facilitated by our relationship with the Pacific Ocean and its waterways. Unfortunately, our communities are also connected through a shared history of settler colonialism, one which has seen the dispossession of both lands and waters, a dual process which has historically been closely intertwined. So it's with great pleasure that our speakers accepted the invitation to come and be here with us today, as I know and am continuously inspired by how deeply committed they are to the well-being of their respective communities. And their commitment manifests in very different forms and practices, which I anticipate will resonate in interesting ways. I'm going to introduce our speakers now. Dr. Marianne Nicolson is a Musqueam Zawadanoch artist and activist. Her practice encompasses photography, painting, light projection, and installation, and includes traditional Kwakwaka'wakw cultural forms, monumental public artworks, and works created for galleries and museums. Marianne holds a PhD in linguistics and anthropology from the University of Victoria. Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson is a Haida musician, author, activist, artist, and lawyer known for her dedication to Haida culture and her work in Indigenous environmental law and Haida music preservation. She formed the White Raven Law Corporation to protect and preserve her people's relationship to the land, and she has represented the Haida Nation at all levels of court. My cousin Morgan Guerin was born and raised at Musqueam. A lifetime of fishing has raised his awareness of the connections between the Musqueam people, their history, and the natural resources of their territories. Morgan has worked as a Musqueam fisheries officer for over 20 years and has served as an elected Musqueam councillor. And most recently, he served as a community curator for the reopened Northwest Coast Hall at the American Museum of Natural History. And finally, I'd like to introduce our session's respondent, Dr. Renisa Mawani. Renisa is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of British Columbia and recurring chair of the Law and Society program. I'm so appreciative of Renisa's scholarship, which, as she notes, has aimed to write the histories of Indigenous dispossession and Asiatic migration from China and India in particular as conjoined and entangled colonial legal processes that are central to the politics of settler colonialism, both today and historically. Indeed, Renisa's work, much of it centered around oceans, was the main source of inspiration for developing the session. So I want to thank our respective speakers and respondents for being here. And I'm just so looking forward to what each of you have to share. And so without further ado, I'll ask Marianne to come and share some of her thoughts and her work. And we'll go from there.
Okay, just point me to the, there we go. Well, thank you everyone who's put so much work into bringing us together, and thank you for the welcome. It's always really grounding for me to hear the language of the land upon which we are present being spoken. So I wanted to start with this image, which is of one of my ancestral villages. This is called Guayastums, and this photo was taken around 1901. The house with the painting on it was my great-grandfather's older brother's house that they all built together. So we used to live in these communal houses, but I want to show this image because it shows the relationship of the water to our communities. So our communities were always built on the shoreline, facing the water, and to the back of us was the woods. And so part of our cardinal directions for the Kwakwaka'wakw are what we would call at, which means behind us, which refers to the woods, and as, which is ahead of us, which it refers to the ocean. So always this in our language and in our cosmology is this idea of connection between the land and the water. But what I learned from my sister who works in stewardship a number of years ago, which really shocked me, which I did not know for most of my life, was that the Canadian government had actually separated jurisdiction of the land and the waters. So it really complicated things for us today. The land jurisdiction is considered provincial and waters federal. So to me, this separation is so indicative of the violence that has been kind of perpetuated upon us, because in our cosmology, these are joined and they operate in tandem together. So the thought of this kind of legislated separation is yet another example of how Indigenous people continue to be separated from their territories in all kinds of ways. So in 2010, there was a massive flood in Kauai, our home village up Kinkum Inlet. It was an unprecedented flood. It rose to about 9 feet. The entire community was evacuated, including my mother, who was somewhat injured while she was being evacuated. It was tremendously traumatic for the community. People had to live outside of the community for quite a long time before they were able to return. Some people never did return. So when I was living at home before I went to university, there was about 120 people living at home, and now we're down to about 65. So the very survival of our community at this point lies in question. And you can see how dramatic this flood was and the effect that it had on us. This was in 2010, and I knew at that point when this happened that this was only the forefront of what was to come. And sure enough, we have seen the evolution of the catastrophe that is facing us. So I ended up creating a series of works on this because it had such an impact on me psychologically. And what I was struggling with, or what I was looking towards, was this idea of the flood and how were we to survive it. And I kept going back to, in processing it, I kept going back to our ways and being in the world, and how our old stories talk about a massive flood that happened amongst our people and how our people managed to survive that flood. So there's a body of work that's been created over the last 10 years, but I wanted to show this work. The film at the Art Gallery is a time lapse of this work. So this was exhibited down at Yale Union in Portland, Oregon during COVID. So I never actually physically saw this work. It was all done by distance. It's called A Feast of Light and Shadows. And in the background, you can see this gigantic photo mural, and that image is of my great-great-grandmother's brother, Jim Humzidi, and his standing beside his feast dish, a giant Unicwa feast dish. And that was a photograph that was taken in Kinkum. And I was thinking about feasting, and I was thinking about economics, and I was thinking about the redistribution of wealth and how different it is between the colonial imposed ideologies and our own fundamental worldview and our way of seeing things. And certainly in our potlatch system, our processes of giving away rather than hoarding, you see this redistribution of wealth that is based on relationship to lands and waters. So in this work, the windows were covered with imagery, and as the shadows moved through the day, they would start from the windows, from the floor, and slowly stretch across until they would fill these bowls, these enamel bowls, which were representative of, they used to give this type of bowl away in our potlatches. And so these shadows would eventually fill these bowls, and it would strike this photograph. And it was really like a daily performance that was done in conjunction with the sun. And I was really looking at the relationship of the interior space to the exterior space, but really also questioning the lack of spiritual engagement in wealth, the ideas of wealth, and how the ocean and the waters have been really stripped, and the lands as well, and how our traditional ways of thinking and being actually are a remedy against that, and how important it is to keep these ideas alive. So I think really what I'm doing often in these pieces is that I'm trying to replicate these concepts and ideas in a modern context as a way of keeping them alive, and as an alternative for what we're actually facing. So it's a strategy against the oncoming flood, I guess. This is an image of some of the line work, I guess the design work that is on the windows. So we have a really wonderful body of histories that talk about seaweedy or the under the sea. So all of this imagery on these windows referred to this very rich history of our relationship to the ocean and our stories about the ocean, and even some of our descent. But in particular, it really referred to our stewardship of the ocean, and how much the ocean is itself considered an equal kingdom to the land, and how blessed we are to have those relationships, and what we must do in order to foster a health and well-being of ourselves within the context of the greater whole. So this line work was done on the windows, but it didn't, there was a ephemerality about it. So it wasn't completely served up for kind of a visual feast. It was somewhat elusive. And this is the view from outside the building at nighttime. And what I was really looking at was, you know, from the outside the building, it would look like the interior was flooded. But from inside the building, when you're looking out, it would look like there was a flood that was happening, and the water level rise was high enough that even though in this building itself you were high up, that the waters had risen that high. And I was thinking about it situationally in Portland. You know, it's a city that's by the water. And so I was also referring back to what had happened to us with our massive flood. And I guess what I'm trying to work with in these pieces is that I do not believe that experience of that 2010 flood was without its lessons. I believe it's given us a tremendous opportunity to reconfigure and rework how we think about things. And for me, it's only become much, much stronger that we must really uphold and look to Indigenous ways of being in order to find the answers for surviving the future that lies ahead of us. And my concern, and I guess I'll kind of try and wrap it up on this point, is that much of the strategies of government and industry are not to uphold, learn, change, and shift according to Indigenous worldview. They're actually looking to incorporate indigeneity into what they're doing. So the fundamental structure remains the same. It's still extractive, it's still destructive, and it's still a colonial ideology. They just are asking that there's a lot of work happening to bring Indigenous peoples into those frameworks. And I'm adamantly opposed to this. I really strongly feel that if that happens, then we have no chance. And the alternative to that, the answer that I feel, having lived through this kind of catastrophes amongst my own family and community, is that we really have to work to advocate that the powers that be, the government and industry, seriously look at structural change, not adaptation, not inclusion. Inclusion is a disaster for us. If Indigenous people are going to sit at the negotiation table and negotiate revenue and negotiate on the basis of that table being a colonial economic table, we will not survive. So I guess I create these works because I feel that they're fundamentally and spiritually grounded in our traditional teachings. And my desire is that we are able to keep those teachings alive, share them, and that there is fundamental change that happens structurally. It must happen economically, and these are the things we must advocate for. So anyways, I'll end it here. Thank you very much.
Sportsly lalakagans hanoti kiaka, tika gels kiawaga, hoyet di kuringe la gutsilga.
My name is Girashotzli Higgins. I'm from the Skidans Raven clan from Haida Gwaii, and today I'm very happy to speak to you and to join you in this discussion. I want to acknowledge that I live and work on the beautiful territory of the Semiemo Nation and also Haida Gwaii, and thank you very much for the welcome this morning. It was so very heartfelt, and it really touched my heart to hear those words and to feel the love behind the welcome. I'm going to start by opening with Haida Gwaii. This is the territory that I come from. It is located north of Vancouver Island and south of Alaska. As an islands community, we're completely surrounded by the water. In fact, in any given location on Haida Gwaii, we are no further than 20 kilometers from the ocean. So oceans are always in our everyday thoughts. Today's question is how to orient the analyses of law to feature oceans more prominently, with attention to Indigenous legal traditions and drawing upon our shared experiences. So I'm going to share photos and videos organized by this symposium title. This slide shows oceans management in Canada and internationally. This is how the colonial state views oceans in law, the segmented zones that Marianne talked about. In Haida Gwaii, we straddle all of those zones. We're located right on the edge of the continental shelf. Plus, our territory extends north into Southeast Alaska, so our territory straddles an international border as well. This colonial conception is not rooted in, tied, or moored to Indigenous legal traditions or our conceptions of reality and our worldviews, which are, of course, the original conceptions of ocean spaces in this country. One of those examples is the Haida worldview of ocean spaces. This is an image that I've created to imagine and to help you imagine how the Haida people view ocean spaces. Our traditions are recorded in a series of narratives that we call Raven traveling. And in these narratives, Raven creates the world as we see it. And in one of those stories, just as Haida Gwaii was coming out of the oceans, all of the supernatural beings had a battle to see who would hold up Haida Gwaii. And unlike the narrative of Atlas, who lost and then had to hold up the world, in our traditions, Kuya Gagandals won the battle. And so Kuya Gagandals is shown at the bottom of this image on the ocean floor. He won the responsibility and the love to hold up Haida Gwaii. And so resting on his chest is a cedar tree, and Haida Gwaii balances on that cedar tree and pole. So right from the beginning of time, we have ingrained in our traditions the importance of seeking balance in everything that we do. As with the Kwakwakiwak, we have no separation between land and sea and airspace. So in the Raven traveling narratives, we often journey down into the undersea world and up into the airspace. And when we journeyed down into the undersea world, we encountered towns that were much like our own towns. And when we went into these big houses and into the longhouses, the supernatural beings and the ocean peoples appeared like us. But when they journeyed up into the human realm, they appeared in killer whale form. So up in the corner, we see killer whales reaching into and coming into the human realm of Haida Gwaii. So the key takeaways from that origin, one of the origin stories, is that our legal traditions are not based on obligations or being required to do something or regulations that say you must do this, but rather it's out of love and responsibility, taking responsibility for our future. We also, of course, have the law of interconnectedness, that everything is interrelated. What we do to the land affects the ocean and vice versa. The interesting thing about the Haida worldview is that we have convergence with the killer whales, in that the killer whale towns are all oriented below each of the towns on Haida Gwaii. So if it's a Raven town, there's also a corresponding killer whale town from the Raven clan in the undersea world. So Leanne Simpson talks about convergence with buffalo. In Haida Gwaii, we have convergence with the killer whale people. So this worldview and the ceremonies generated a very sophisticated performance-based legal tradition. And so that means that our laws are not just written, but they're generated, and we learn about them through place-based activities on the land and sea and in potlatches, as Marianne mentioned. And I wanted to share a video in my next slide, just to emphasize that we're not just here in an academic way to talk about what we're going to do, but actually grounding us in our ceremonies in the land and sea. And this is a video of a potlatch that my husband and I hosted in Heidelberg. That's the town that he was born in. So potlatches are an event where we celebrate the bounty of the land and sea around us, of the beings who give up their lives so that we can continue to exist. That fragmented and very structured worldview of the oceans has allowed for the taking of incredible amounts of ocean beings from our oceans. Every year, on average, there is $84 million worth of fish taken from Haida Gwaii. Several marine species on Haida Gwaii range from fully exploited to overexploited. Haida Gwaii has 2 of the top 10 commercial fisheries in this province. Globally, over 90% of marine stocks are fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. So without an anchor in Indigenous legal traditions, oceans governance and management is segmented and fragmented, increasing the taking and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. Now, I was intrigued by Renisa's idea that oceans are archives of the colonial encounter, and I wanted to share some of the archives of Haida Gwaii's oceans. Oceans are an archive of supernatural beings, and so my art practice is looking at female supernatural beings and crest figures. This is Octopus Woman, and she is a crest of some of the clans on Haida Gwaii. And it was inspired by my husband's artwork called Occupied, which presents a number of octopus in the Haida form line art that completely fills the canvas. And it was a statement about our requirement to prove title to every square inch of our territories and marine spaces in order to be successful in litigation. But yet we're in this stage where we're looking to Indigenous legal traditions. And so I've ghosted in behind the background his artwork, Occupied, as both as a statement of our need to prove title to every square inch, but also by the fact that the colonial encounter has made it difficult for Indigenous peoples to recognize Indigenous legal traditions as laws. So we've grown up in this idea that we have protocols, that we have principles, but not laws. And so our practice is recognizing that they are in fact laws. But yet at the same time, it's a dichotomy where we live and breathe our laws, but it's just a reawakening to the fact that these are laws. We are also in a state of transformation. Much of our artwork will show that transformation. Many of the beings that appear on carved totem poles are beings that are in states of half transformation. And I look at that as this journey where we're not where we fully need to be, but yet every stage along the way is an important part of that transformation. And we acknowledge where we are right now and where we have to go, but not make wrong where we are, but keeping an eye on where we need to be at the end of the day. So this is Octopus Woman, who's in a half state of transformation. She's in that burgundy color of that octopus become when they're enraged. I don't know if any of you have gone out onto the land and captured octopus, but they become very angry when you take them from under a rock. And so she's in that state and challenging the Canadian state that we are prepared to go to battle, and we are in battle for our territories. So using the Haida Nation as an example, in 2015, we successfully obtained an injunction against the opening of the herring fishery on Haida Gwaii. It remains closed to this day because the stocks need to recover. We're in an active Haida title case right now, and we're seeking Haida title to the seabed, given that we are an islands community. We regularly intervene in litigation that raises issues that are brought in our title case. And so, for example, this past week, we filed an intervention application in a whole series of class action lawsuits that are being brought forward of fishermen associations claiming compensation for their rights being taken away through the creation of marine protected areas. These are marine protected areas that the Haida have created to protect and leave spaces in the ocean for the rejuvenation of fishery stocks such as herring. So with this litigation comes the challenge of trying to address these racist legal fictions that require proof to our own territories and that require that we must meet tests that are created by the colonial state. We have not yet seen our way of seeing the world in those legal tests, and especially not for tests for marine title, which are only land-based and not ocean-based. So the mismanagement of fishery is one part of the archives. The other part of the archive is the colonial encounter. And this is an image that Bill Holm created and allowed me to include in my master's thesis that records that moment of meeting Juan Perez in 1774 at the northwestern tip of Haida Gwaii. And like other archives, these such encounters are only recorded, at least in writing, from the perspective of the colonizers and often from the perspective of men. And so in my master's thesis, I speak about that encounter from a woman's perspective, why she would have traded her cedar bark hat and an amulet. She's shown just behind the head canoe there, and her inspiration to create a raven's tail and nahin or chilkat robe for her father, and the whole upholding of the potlatch system and Haida identity. The ceremonies that we conducted before Juan Perez are the very same ceremonies that we're conducting today over the ocean spaces, over the supernatural beings that live in the ocean realm. This is a ceremony conducted in 1996. The canoes are coming ashore in my village of Skidegate. So all of the protocols that are associated with how you come ashore and how you seek permission, they're still maintained in all of the traditions here on the coast. These ceremonies are part of the ocean archives, but so too are the female supernatural beings that blanket the land and sea. So one of the leading supernatural beings in the Haida worldview is Foam Woman, and she is the ancestress of all the Haida people who belong to the Raven clan. And she came out of the ocean at Skin Cuddle Inlet in Guayhanas, and she had multiple breasts, and she nurtured all of the ancestresses of the women who gave birth to all the Haida women who belong to the Raven clan on Haida Gwaii. She gave birth to flood tide woman. So floods are part of our narratives, and she taught us about the law of interconnectedness. So John Burroughs writes that laws are written on the land, and I believe that they're also written on the sea. And so he calls a source of law as natural laws. And these are laws where you look to the biological functions around you to see what the laws might be. And so in my practice, I do that. I look at the biological functions and the narratives to see what Haida laws come from those narratives. And I look to foam. And so in the oceans and in the rivers, foam is created by a turbulent action with protein in the middle of that turbulence, and out of that protein and the churning of the water comes foam. And so at the emergence of foam women in Guayhanas, we were the protein in the water. We came from the oceans, and we learned from foam women that we are no better than the smallest little creel or whatever those beings are in the oceans. We're all interconnected. We all have that shared origin. Now I want to show an example of my music practice and the teachings that I try to draw out of the oceans and reflect in music. I agree with Marianne's point about always beginning from our basis. And so the music that I create is based in Haida musical traditions, incorporating in other elements, but not the other way around. I will say one thing that because I am looking at the biological functions of foam, I chose to make her hair the color of foam. I did not choose to make her hair the color of a European woman, which some people often react to. One of the laws that foam women taught us is the law of interconnectedness, as I spoke about. And the Haida have integrated the fundamental laws into management plans, managing ocean spaces. Canada and BC have agreed to those laws in the management of marine spaces. I believe, as I said, that laws are also written in the ocean themselves. The Foam Woman song came from traveling over the oceans in Haida Gwaii, but they are also encoded and written on cultural keystone species such as the cedar tree. This diagram illustrates my master's thesis on my looking for a different way to analyze Indigenous legal traditions rather than just a case brief method that most lawyers use. I wanted one that elders could learn from and would easily understand. And so I've assigned those fundamental laws. As it turns out, each function of the cedar tree related to each of the fundamental laws that the Haida have already articulated and are using in the management of marine spaces. I believe that every cultural keystone species has important laws to share with us for how to live with the earth. So this research is driven by a desire to decolonize, as I said, how we analyze and look at Indigenous legal traditions. Finally, this is my last slide. I believe that there is an opportunity for Indigenous nations to guide us ashore, away from the conceptions of ocean spaces that mismanage for the ocean beings and for the oceans themselves. The resurgence of Indigenous legal traditions is being done during the next wave of colonization, that of climate change, which is taking away our territories through floods, through rising sea levels, through all of the things that have come with climate change. John Burroughs says that reconciliation is not just reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, but rather it is reconciliation with the earth. And I say it is also reconciliation with the oceans. The primary laws that I see coming from the oceans is this sense of perpetual energy, just unending, coming ashore, coming ashore, coming ashore, renewal and resurgence. And so my PhD research will look at how the laws arising from the ocean spaces to help get us through the climate change crisis that we face today. So like my brother-in-law, Reg-Davidson, who is the steersman of this canoe, Indigenous legal traditions can be the steersman to help guide us in our journey so that we're not adrift in our relationship with the oceans. Thank you.
Jim Nisiaya, your friends and relatives at the Setzeleno. My name is Morgan Guerin. My ancestral name is Setzeleno. And it's very good to have each and every one of you here today. Asked to come and say a few words about where I'm from and what I do and the continuing works and following my relatives, our connection to who we are and where we're going. Oh, I think I'm a little more blind than I was yesterday. Okay. First and foremost, I'd like to let everybody know that I have a condition where I get quite tired. And today I woke up and I felt it. So if you see me occasionally yawn or blink, it's not because I'm not excited to be here. It's actually the opposite. And my body's telling me to calm down. So, but I came today with just that, words of my ancestors. So I belong to the Musqueam First Nation. I work as a senior marine planning specialist and marine enforcement coordinator. For the past 20 some odd years before that, I worked as one of our Aboriginal fishery officers and senior Aboriginal fishery officers, not just for Musqueam, but for my territory. And I was on loan many times to other places to go do that work in other regions, which was quite an honor to have the trust of other nations as well say, can you come and help us out? Which shows a lot of how our core fundamental teachings are actually very, very strongly similar. The red string of fate is really tied between because of that connection that we all have to Mother Earth. Actually, I think that's maybe where I'll start. I love doing these because I don't know what I'm going to say until I'm here. I really don't. There's 15,000 plus years. I just need to figure out what needs to be said. But Grandpa said, go up there with an open heart and open your hand. And that's what I intend to do today. So the Musqueam people have always been at the mouth of what's known as the Fraser River. And everybody kind of know where that is. And I know that we've got some people online. So the river delta that's adjacent to in between what's the city of Vancouver and say city of Delta and Swassen. So this delta system has always been absolutely tied to the Musqueam people. And our responsibility and stewardship has always been tied to these waters in a very important way. So Musqueam, at one time, the mouth of what's now known as the Fraser River was actually up in the area closer to New Westminster Delta. Does everybody kind of know where that is here? And when you looked out to sea, there was no what's known as Lulu Island or the city of Richmond. Didn't exist, just water looking out. So in our oral histories, we go back adjacent to the ancestors who were alive at that time. Okay, and through our oral histories, we talk about who was taking care of the land there at that time. Now, this really starts to form a very important piece of our ancestral laws. And our language, that beautiful language you heard spoken, my cousin Vanessa is, I love listening to her. When she picked up the language and started to learn it and speak it, she speaks it with the same voice that our elders did. She really does. She sounds like our old people. So to hear it come alive is not only a beautiful reminder of the grandparents that I grew up with, the knowledge keepers who transferred the knowledge that I can actually speak to you from here, but also a good reminder of those rules and those laws that we have. One that I say quite often so people understand our perspective in Musqueam, our Hunkaminam language of the Musqueam, Squamish, or sorry, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, and Tsawwassen people. In our language, we refer to someone who's Hualmuch. Hualmuch means a First Nation person, but it doesn't translate that way. It translates to you and the earth belong to each other. And that's an important thing to understand when we set the grounding for what comes next. So my grandmother told me in a scolding, because I said, and I'll be blunt, I was small. Mom, why did the white people steal all the land from us? Well, I got a scolding for two reasons. One, my mom's Norwegian. So two, you can't steal it. You can't steal it. Said, you belong to the earth like a child belongs to their mother. You belong to me and I belong to you. Can you sell me? No. Can I sell you? And she said, I wish I could. But then I had an understanding of that the land and the waters were so much more than something that you govern or have domain over. You have responsibility to. And that is the foundation of our stewardship and where our laws belong. So as my cousin Vanessa was up here giving a welcoming, there'd actually be two welcomings that you'd get. Well, the first one we use as we call it a welcoming, but it's a little presumptuous. So our warriors would be at the village of Cullahan, which is adjacent to where UBC is now. And they'd look out from that high point and they'd look out to the waters and they'd see canoes coming in. And then they would dispatch warriors to go out to see these canoes. And the warrior would then, the speaker on behalf of the families and the warrior would ask, do you come in peace? Right? The other question, there's two questions. The other question he'd be asked is, and what's your business here? That second question, when I asked about it with my elders, because he said, you're going to go out to do these welcomings when you get older. You need to understand why you're doing them. So the second point of that question, what is your business here, is because you're looking after Mother Earth. You are her steward, you are her voice. So if someone else was to come into the territory and they start doing things which are going to affect her, it's your job as a steward to stop that, to correct that, and to guide them on a good path. So if I move forward from when Musqueam was at the village of Sequexin, which is, anywhere but you, I don't do dates, I do oral histories. But our anthropology folk love to do dates around anywhere from 12,000 to 7,000 years old, depending on which section of the village you're looking at. And as we watched, and the city, where the city of Richmond would become. And all of our beautiful place names would start to pop up because we lived and grew with her. And as we moved down, we had the village of Cessnock, which is in the Marpole area of Vancouver. I'm giving you current place names, so you got an idea of what I'm talking about. Near the bridge that leads out to the airport. Well, this village, 1,000 years before the first 2 blocks of the pyramids were stacked, was arguably one of the largest trading ports in the world. And was also home to a midden. And to those who don't know what a midden is, it's an ancestral garbage dump where we actually chuck our oyster shells and our clam shells and we eat and we dump them out on the back to the river when they're done. Many of the teachings following a lot of what I've heard from my relatives up north. You pay back what you've been given and you respect that. But inside of this midden is, of course, all the belongings. The old word people used to like to use as artifacts, which is actually quite offensive to us. But belongings or treasures would actually be locked in time. 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years. But what's actually truly amazing is the size of this midden, which is, you know, up to 40 feet deep, up to 300 feet wide, and over a couple of kilometers long. So did a couple of us Musqueams do that? You're starting to see how many people were living in that area and how they were living sustainably millennia after millennia, not only stewarding themselves, how much can I take, but how much time we have or how much can we give to those who are coming to us. So with that teaching of Kwamo, we become stewards, okay? The next teaching that we give is to share. But you have to share with stewardship in mind first. So you bring your family in. The family here has a system of governance and protocols and laws, which then help to look after the other family that's come in while they're here. And then the transfer of those things as we move forward. So this system worked millennia after millennia. And then something happened. So my grandpa lived on an island just across from us, which is now known as Iona. And when he lived there, he was about 5 years old and he thought he could go see his cousin on the other side of the river. So it's about 600 yards in between. And he thought that he could go see his cousin by walking on the backs of the fish to get there. So this is 1910. Okay, so he's born in 1910. So this is about 1914, 1915. He's a little guy. Auntie had to come and grab him. That was the state of abundance that we had in the Fraser River. My cousin spoke about my great grand uncle, Chief Wahuilak, okay, who would have been uncle to my grandpa. 1 year later was talking about the immense decline and our ability to actually access the resource. Can you only imagine what Wahuilak was referring to if this is what the decline looked like to him? So with these very complex, and there's a 6-hour TED talk just to get the idea of it, complex set of laws in order to maintain stewardship in the area and the responsibility of stewardship that come into the area. And then the introduction of smallpox happens. This is the late 1700s. So smallpox hit our nation and surrounding areas long before, or about a few years before European contact physically came to us, but actually came through those trade routes. So Cessnock was also one of the largest trading ports in the world at that time too, as well. So my cousin Jordan, myself, Vanessa, we're the descendants of the less than 1% who actually survived the smallpox. This is very important when we talk about the transition of where these powers came to be. It would be a very, very different conversation if Musqueam were still sitting in a place where they had upwards of 100,000 inhabitants around the peninsula saying, no, we've got this, we're going to steward this, come and live with us. instead of being in the midst of basically an apocalyptic movie to others, just trying to survive. But that didn't mean that the teachings of stewardship ever ended. And they still continue today. But I will say that stopping the Indigenous people of Canada from being able to exercise their responsibility, absolute responsibility, the same as all of us have to our mother, the responsibility we have to look after our mother as she's looked after us, is an absolute dark chapter in Canadian history that still exists today. I know because I sit on, Musqueam has been for many years now talking about self-governance with many of our colleagues across the board. And I'll tell you, there is still an argument that's happening today about not only the fish you catch, but what you do with that fish. The argument my great-granduncle had in 1914 is still on the table and still has not been resolved. This isn't a conversation about conservation. This is a conversation about capitalism and how we are still standing in the way of natural resource extraction for the benefit of others. But as I said, as we've learned that Mother Earth is our mom. And if she gives your hair, and I told some kids this the other day, if your mom gives you your hair to weave a bracelet to remember her by, or to take care of yourself, well, Mother Earth is bald now. There's nothing left to give. And now we're talking about stewardship on a collaborative measure. But those are just words if we're still having the same conversations on the other side. That said, I'm very happy and very honored to share just a little piece today, and just a little piece. As I said, I could be up here for quite some time. But because this is in the work that I do for Musqueam and for Indigenous people everywhere across Canada, is about lending perspectives so that the next generation can understand. And the more education that we do in stewardship, the more I'm hoping that my grandchildren's and my great-grandchildren's generation are actually looking on equal and common narratives and ideologies. We need to look after Mother Earth first, instead of, yeah, but how are we going to pay for X? Well, that tap's going to run out. So that said, I like to open it up because I know we're going to have more conversation later. But that said, from the bottom of my heart, I want to say Haitsepta, which means thank you to you all for spending a little bit of time to come here with open ears and an open heart, and maybe help plant some I can't give you the tree to walk out the door, but I can show you the seed and show you what it can grow into. And there's much more of a conversation to be had. So thank you all.
I'm going to just stand here so that I can take my mask off. So I'd like to begin by thanking the Musqueam and Vanessa in particular for the very warm welcome. And I'd like to thank the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people for their hospitality as a visitor on this land. And thank you to the organizers, Denise, and especially to Jordan for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really excited for the next few days, and I look forward to listening and learning from everybody. So I'm a scholar of colonial legal history, and I thought what I would do is maybe just situate my listening of our amazing speakers today through some brief remarks. And hopefully you'll see why or how my remarks are relevant. So in 1603, a Dutch fleet led by Jacob van Heemskerk seized the Santa Catarina, a Portuguese carrack in the Straits of Singapore. In response, the Dutch East India Company commissioned a young jurist, Hugo Grotius, to advise on the lawfulness of van Heemskerk's actions. Was this an act of profiteering or privacy? Was it legal or illegal? In his reply, published anonymously in 1609 as Mare Liberum, or Free Sea, Grotius argued that the sea was to be held in common to all. The world's oceans, he said, were legally open and available to European trade and commerce. Certain trade routes might be controlled through the movement of ships, he argued, but the sea itself could not be possessed or owned, although the fish that were caught could be. Terri-Lynn and Morgan have discussed the devastating implications of fish and fish stores for us today. The Dutch capture of the Santa Catarina, I argue in my work, initiated a protracted set of deliberations which continue into the present day. So for some, Grotius and Mare Liberum may be familiar. I know that Aisha has written about Grotius as well. Both are commonly referenced in discussions of international law, particularly in the law of the sea. But what falls out of focus is that imperial disputes over the sea to which Grotius was responding emerged from the capture of a vessel that was traveling along the Indian Ocean from the Portuguese-controlled territories of Macau to Goa. So the ship, the Indian Ocean, which is of course a vast ocean region in the global south, and the European quest to control the seas sit at the center of a European international legal order. And their significance is often obscured by a terracentric and Eurocentric bias. So the terracentric bias being that international law emerged from the land or from boardrooms in Europe, and the Eurocentric bias being the erasure of the Indian Ocean and its polyglot and plural world, including legalities. In chapter 12 of the commentary on the law of prize and booty, to which was to become Mare Liberum, Grotius wrote, "A ship sailing over the sea no more leaves behind itself a legal right than it leaves a permanent mark." So part of what my work has really tried to attend to is what happens when we actually really center the ship and follow it through time and space. What do we see? When viewed through legal orders and changing climates, ships do leave a trace. The Dutch seizure of the Santa Catarina, for example, has a long legacy of imposing lines and dividing the sea, ignoring the legal orders of Indigenous people, Asian and Muslim seafarers, and contributing to the ongoing exploitation and extinction of marine ecologies. Under the auspices of free trade and a free sea, European empires have left their mark on the world's oceans through imperial expansion, colonial extraction, and racial exploitation. And Marianne, Terri-Lynn, and Morgan all point to what some of the consequences of these lines and forms of extraction and exploitation have been. Terri-Lynn showed us on one of her slides the imposed divides that separate and distinguish oceans as territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, the continental shelf, and the high sea, which is ostensibly free. The freedom of the seas remains foundational to the international law of the sea today. Grotius's arguments, which drew a legal distinction between land and sea, which required different juridical orders, and that Marianne very appropriately identified as a form of colonial violence, remains vividly apparent in colonial laws in Canada and internationally. So the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea for example, most explicitly identifies Grotius's thinking in section 87.1, freedom of the high sea. So alongside plastics and industrial pollution, ships, which I see as an expression of international law, have changed the composition of oceans as evidenced in ocean acidification, depleting oxygen levels, and warming waters. And in the contemporary moment, when 90% of the world's goods continue to be transported by sea, what sorts of methods do we need to join the violences of the past to the violences of the present, without losing sight of the uneven vulnerabilities and unequal responsibilities of climate catastrophe? What would it mean to foreground the role of European ships as agents and expressions of international law implicated in Indigenous struggles over land, waterways, and sovereignty, in the theft and forced transport of 12.5 million captive Africans, and the ongoing lives of transatlantic slavery, in Chinese and Indian indenture, forced migration, and in ongoing migrant deaths at sea? Centering oceans and waterways as life forces, as we've just heard from our distinguished panelists, invites ways to, on the one hand, recall and remember the violences of colonialism and colonial extraction that remain ongoing, while also rethinking questions of law, sovereignty, climate catastrophe, and responsibility through histories of people, place, and struggle. And as Marianne, Terri-Lynn, and Morgan have pointed out, this requires a profound shift. What I always find quite astonishing is how governments, policymakers, and the United Nations often hail colonial law as the answer to climate change, as opposed to a problem and its conditions of possibility. As our panelists have told us today, addressing our contemporary moment requires us to recenter the teachings of Indigenous people around the inseparability of land and sea, which has become the legal foundation of many national laws and also of international law, the interconnections of all creatures, including supernatural beings. Marianne, Terri-Lynn, and Morgan have pointed to the rich archives we need to draw from: stories of abundance in the Fraser River, stories of floods, the teachers, the ancestors, the land, skies, seas, and the supernatural beings that we need to hear in order to live with the earth. We also need to really listen to oceans and rivers, and this is a conversation that I was having with Rita Wong yesterday at Musqueam, as they speak to us through rising sea levels, floods, and submergence. And so I guess the question I have to the audience, and because we've already heard from the panelists, but maybe this is a conversation we can continue, which is, how do we encourage this or make this shift possible? And the shift is not just about where we sort of center law, but it's really about listening to Indigenous people, listening to the earth, listening to other cosmologies, and embracing other epistemologies. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. For myself, drawing on my experience as a fishery officer has taught me one thing. I can write 20,000 tickets and it will make no difference. The only person who comes away from that is in the plus is the Receiver General of Canada. Those monies are not cited back to stewardship. They're just go into general coffers, and then political decisions from the top move down. So it all depends on what the political will of the day is. And this is where I found myself shifting much more to education, conversation, and changing the narrative. I think I said it earlier, I don't want to hand off to my grandchildren the same conversation that my great-granduncle had and I'm still having. So letting those perceptions be understood, letting those worldviews still be known. And especially with an Indigenous lens, an Indigenous worldview. I mean, let's put it this way. When we're talking about oceans, we talk about the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I have not had the best relationship with them over the past 20 years. From an enforcement level up to a policy level is probably, and I will say this freely, is the most systemically racist ministry in Canada, bar none. As an enforcement officer, I was taught at the very beginning, you will run into two races of people who will be 100% of your clientele. And the first one off the bat was Indians, was the word that was used. I went into my troop in 2000. This is not an ancient history. These people that I went, who were within my troop, were the fishery officer troop I went in. And the fishery officer career progression program, this is where they were taught this, are now managers. Right? They're sitting at very high levels with 25 years of experience. And this is their basis. When in fact, you look at the traditional ecological knowledge of our Indigenous people, has such rigor to it, as opposed to, and I'm just not, I am all for a higher education, quote unquote, higher education. I tell my children, I want you guys to get your degrees, but don't forget the degree that you had coming here in Musqueam as well. And I know all of my friends here were raised the same way. That is across the board throughout the Northwest Coast and across Canada with our Indigenous people. Know who you are and where you come from. So traditional ecological knowledge is a constant state intake of information. Okay. This means I have to be out on the river and ocean as much as humanly possible. That information is captured about what is happening, what is changing, what was different from before, and then has to be transferred with oral history rigor. And if anybody doesn't know what that means, it means you get yelled at a lot until you understand how to take in oral history and repeat it back. Far more rigor is put into the collection of this information than does. And yet, when I'm at the table, speaking with Department of Fisheries and Oceans, we are taught about, well, a study was done in 1974 on the effects of X on fish. Traditional ecological knowledge says, well, yeah, we saw that then too, and now we're telling you in the last, 46 years, 47 years, that a few things have changed, including the climate and environment around us. And it's a hard position to get those two things to meld. So anyways, I think to start it off is education, stewardship, but being open. Many people don't understand that they are not by any definition, they are not by any definition a racist, but they are working in a systemically racist system. And they don't know that they are passing along what's been deemed as being the good culture, a colonialistic way of saying, we got it, we know what we're doing. Well, we left you alone to look after for 150 years, and now we are in the most catastrophic returns of salmon we've ever seen in our waters. So, I mean, if there's a report card on this one, I don't think your parents are going to be happy about it, right? So being able to hit the brakes and saying it's not going right. So let's look at what happened when it was going right. To shed off the colonial veil of saying we know better. And to stop trying to diminish the integrity of Indigenous ancestral ways of knowing. So I think that's something I'd like to see our next generation really get right.
Yeah, I guess I agree with absolutely everything that's been articulated this morning, and I also find it kind of uplifting and gives me some sense of strength to know that other nations are pushing back and being assertive, because we have to be, and that's our reality. You know, I have to admit frustration, because with all of the talk of reconciliation in Canada, the real work that needs to be done often just gets sidelined by colonial adaptations. You know, it's the same agenda, it just gets adapted. And, you know, we have a stewardship department for our nation, Saudino First Nation. And that stewardship department is poor. The funding streams that are available to our nations in our territories are purposely leading us into negotiation frameworks. And those frameworks are built on capitalist extractivism. So our stewardship department doesn't get the same support as the extractivist enterprises that are more or less seducing our leadership. And so it was heartbreaking to attend a meeting, our annual general meeting for our nation. And then the stewardship department, one person, my sister, who can't keep up with all of the paperwork that's involved, that keeps us from the really, really important work that needs to be done. And it's being difficult because structurally, and this is why I want to look at these structural issues, because there is the enticement of capitalism that will deliberately posit funds for specific types of engagements over others. And stewardship tends not to be a priority, and neither does land and water jurisdiction. Those are things that are left in our hands to deal with, while all kinds of funding is being put forward for us to come to the table and to, in a way, compromise our own assertions of jurisdiction, right? So now we're at the table and we're negotiating over something that is non-negotiable and shouldn't be negotiated. And so I want to speak to that reality, because it's difficult to watch, say, what's put out in the media as all of these reconciliatory actions in this country, when it comes down to the underlying structures. You know, things are not changing as they should be. They're shifting, yes, and the language is shifting, but the structural undercurrent of that is not shifting. And that's why it's hard sometimes you want to have hope, but it really has been a long, difficult road for my own community to uphold what is our jurisdiction within our territory. So I'm really grateful for what I've heard this morning, because it helps me to know the other nations too carry the same teachings that were brought down, and there was a huge effort for those teachings to be kept alive for us, so that our generation would still know them. You know, but it is really hopeful. Like, it's amazing, really, that I can hear the same teachings being spoken, coming through from the other nations. So that gives me hope. The other side of the table, not very much hope, but on our side of the table, I have hope. Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah. In some ways a question for you, Terri-Lynn, but also opening it up to the floor as well. Is like, what struck me about your talk and the other words that were shared by Morgan and Marianne was, to me, kind of what resonated was this idea of like translation, the translation of our histories and our knowledges and our languages, and you know, like the ways in which you've approached that as an artist. But I was also kind of wondering in terms of, you know, you spoke about Haida law being generated and performance-based, and like what that disjuncture looks like compared to Canadian colonial law, and how that's being, how you're approaching that in the work that you do and that your team does in terms of, what we've been speaking about in terms of sharing what we know and speaking to what we know and refusing colonial systems, but then also this dilemma of having to educate and try to shift the minds of the parties that we're engaged with.
Sure. Will start by saying that in 1974, the Haida formed the Council of the Haida Nation, and we realized that we needed a body that would deal with the foreign governments of British Columbia and Canada, and that it needed to be a governance structure that was our own, that was not a band council, that was not a tribal council, but that was rooted in getting direction and mandate from the land and sea. So our approach then has allowed us to draw always on our teachings primarily, instead of being beholden to someone else saying what we can and can't do with our funding. But as a result, our funding is very limited because we're not a tribal council, and because we keep the two band councils operating on local social issues. But I think that really is important to begin from a traditional structure, because then it helps open up what we will do going forward. And so we made a decision that it was more important to reach agreements on protection of spaces instead of pushing for sovereignty, and that we would then develop our own capacity to manage the land and sea. We entered into a reconciliation protocol, but we knew we didn't like the word reconciliation, and so we named that protocol in our own language, which meant the beginning. So we're just beginning the work. It isn't signing an agreement and that's the end of it, and we've dealt with all of the issues on Haida Gwaii. We're just starting. So we've protected 75% of the land base of Haida Gwaii and portions of the ocean spaces. But our approach has been just to do it. We're not waiting for the government to recognize us as a nation, to recognize our rights, even though we're engaged in litigation, and to keep fostering at the community level the laws and the songs, and returning to the stories and coming back to the art, because we've all had the same experience of our ceremonies being outlawed, of our not being able to share our songs or our language. So it is a process of hearing our elders in a new way and bringing forward the knowledge. I'm always inspired by my husband, who says that ceremonies are what are relevant to people today. So our ceremonies and our art must remain relevant to contemporary people who are living in the midst of this colonial violence, but yet still must be tied to the beautiful teachings in the past. In our early efforts, we recognize that the word Haida means the people, and that the people on Haida Gwaii, the settlers, are people too, and that we needed to enter into engaging with them because we were intermarrying, and that we together needed to find a way forward. And that's been part of our strength in our litigation, is ensuring that the settler communities were with us in our actions. So that's a lot, and I don't know if it answered your question, but thank you.
I mean, when we're talking about using those old teachings, and I love my relative for bringing that up because it leads into many conversations, right? A worldview and a perception. The colonialist mindset is, how does that fit into my way of knowing? And that's a big difference. So I need to categorize what you're saying into my understanding. I need to take it, and I will tell you what it means. Genocide. One of the tenets of genocide is removing children from their parents. Okay. in my language. Huamu, you belong to the earth. That's your mother. So removing a Musqueam, a Hunkaminam speaking person from the land is an act of genocide. And it's the entrenched colonial mindset goes, no, 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 it doesn't fit our definition. Of course it wouldn't. It would look very badly if it did, right? So not only remembering our old laws where we come from, I know as an elected councillor and as a voice in my community, I've said many times over, I'll be damned if we take a white bureaucratic paper, paint it Musqueam colors and say, there we go. It has to be built from our laws, our way of knowing, the things that have always worked. Understanding that there's another world that it has to work with only because it has a very entrenched colonial mindset of we need to fit together. But I really like the point that Terri-Lynn brought up too about our family, our settler family that's living with us is not separate from the conversation. In Musqueam, where we're sitting right now, you know, Musqueam is not part of Vancouver's story. It's the other way around. So carrying on this lineage of history, how do we come to live with our new relatives? I'm a product of the new world coming to Musqueam, a proud product of that. So, but with our understanding of our right comes a responsibility. And everyone who walks across Mother Earth shares the same responsibility. Everyone does. And the sooner that we all understand that, the less we scrape off the entitlement of I have dominion over this land, rather it's something that I live with, the sooner that narrative dies, the faster we can get on to globally healing. And sometimes we just need a generation to say there's a better way and do it for the next generation to go, I can do better than that. And I really want them to. So just a few of my thoughts on a little bit of that transition of perspective and some of the teachings that have come from the past to now. And there is tremendous strength in knowing who you are and where you're from, especially to making the decisions to where you're going to go.
The benefit to this nice intimate group that we have here is, you know, we can engage in a broader conversation. I know Renisa was really curious to hear from anyone in the audience, and if people have questions, I'm also able to see if there's any questions from our online audience. If anyone who's tuning in, oh, we have a volunteer already. Thank you.
Good morning to you all, and it has been a real honor to sit and listen to you all and to hear the opening greeting, which sounded like a prayer to me. Morgan, you said a couple of things that really, but everyone said lots and lots of things. The comment about the additive approach to reconciliation, you just add on, you know, whatever culture it is totally unacceptable. But Morgan, two things you said to me resonated, and I don't know if it's a question so much as for me, it's just something I'm wrestling with. You talked about the earth and your grandmother Kukum, or your mother saying you can't steal it. What that generated for me was something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of my own people who were brought here. You know, I say that these lands were settled on actually forensic landscapes. The first crime being the theft of the land, and the second crime, stealing a people to put on stolen land. So when I think of my people who are the descendants of that, I always say that my freedom was not theirs to take, so they can't give it back to me. Which sounds, in terms of my community, almost heretical because, you know, we celebrate Emancipation Day and so on. So I'm really trying to struggle with that, because when I hear you make that comment about the land, it has the same resonance for me. I understand it in here, but yet I know that the land was stolen. I know that there are laws. I know we were stolen. There were laws that, so that was one question, not question, but point of struggling with something. And the second one was when you talked about rigor, because it's a word I don't like to use because it's so associated with the academy. But you're so right, because for your peoples to have survived and ours to have survived, to meet the cataclysm that was colonialism, there had to be an internal rigor and strength to meet that. And yet, time and time again, artists, myself included, you get met with this assumption that somehow you're just doing this, that there's no philosophy, there's no forethought, there's no analysis. So I just wanted to say that and share that with you. But if you can maybe expand on that apparent dichotomy that no, you can't steal the land. It belongs to everyone, but yet we know we live with that. Just in that, you can't steal me, I belong to myself.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I spend the majority of my day working on behalf of my nation and my Indigenous families, providing perspective. So it's an outward sort of conversation. Here's how we see things. And it depends on the listener on the other side. I've got a great group of people in front of me today. This is not who I spend my days with, right? Yeah, but the computer says no, right? No, we can't do that because that won't fit into the fact that, you know, the king and queen are, you know, in charge of all this, et cetera. Oh, really? Okay. I haven't seen them lately. So they're pretty horrible landlords, if you ask me. So the conversation about having that connection to Mother Earth and something that cannot be stolen. She's still there. She's still my mom. People can run around all crazy saying that they're in charge of my mom and they know how to dress her the best and she's going bald and we're sitting there just waiting for people to be done so we can get back to looking after mom. And if that isn't the simplest analogy I can give from a perspective of how one who has to do this on the front line every day feels deflated, because the person who's running around saying that that person belongs to them now really truly believes it, right? So it is tough because there's an attrition mentally that goes with it. But I constantly follow the advice given to me by my elders and now my ancestors of grounding yourself and being in those places and remembering, be with your mom by yourself and having those quiet conversations and listening to her. And that's traditional ecological knowledge. It's all part of, they cannot be delineated, they're all together. So there is a very, very powerful sense of responsibility that goes with it, but that responsibility is also tied to love. And the colonialistic approach is to diminish anything that speaks otherwise to the colonial process, okay? So traditional ecological knowledge isn't written down, ergo it can't be as strong as a written document. Pardon my French, what an utter load of horseshit. You talk about something that's written down, and as simple as this, in 300 years, everyone will pick that document up and have a different perspective, because like my relative was saying about how we review or how we live in the time that we're in, we'll look at a 200-year-old document and they will put perception on there. I perceive this to be X. There is not perception in oral history when it's actually said. That goes to that rigor I was talking about. No, 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 that's not how that works. He said this because this, do you think he meant this? I'm telling you what he said. Because then the oral document goes down the history. My late elder, who's like a grandpa to me, okay, when we speak about this rigor, one of the greatest teachings I had was there was a log he was working on to carve a canoe. And I said something and he goes, that's not how I said that. And I was like, oh, here we go. I'm about to get a scolding, which is some of the best teachings. And he goes, grab that string line and go walk to the end of the log. Okay. And he goes, I'm going to hold it on this finger. Okay. You changed what I said that much. You walk this way until the string touches this finger. And when I did, the log disappeared. Because at 50 feet, changing it this much then turns that onto an arc that goes off of here. So at the age of 9, I got a lesson in why that rigor needs to be maintained. And then that also goes back to understanding who your mother is. Right? When we talk about those traditional ecological knowledge, when it goes down that line of history, you can't turn it into fairy tales. This is why sometimes I have a real hard time with when we say stories. And I say histories. Oh, that can't be history. It absolutely is. It absolutely is. As someone who lives in a very, very fast world, but I tell you every once in a while, and I have been able to do it, I take off to go live in the woods for about 3 weeks to go hunting. I only spend about 3 days hunting. The rest I'm done. I've got my game. It's hanging up. But the other 3 weeks are caring to the game and taking care of the land that I was in, especially because I live in Vancouver. I'm not hunting in Stanley Park. Not too many elk. So I go up to my relatives who have allowed me into their territory. I bring up my protocol. They teach me about the land. They transfer some of that traditional ecological knowledge because I'm harvesting there, I need to put back in what I've taken away, right? And when you come back, those elders, and they mock about things like, no, you learn to listen. You understand that the birds have a language and they're telling you something. As a fishery officer, I've been in my boat, taking my notes, look over at my partner and his eyes are about this big because an orca breached right where my relative's foot is on the side of me and I didn't even hear. I looked over and I saw an eyeball the size of this cup looking at me, making sure I wasn't doing anything wrong. And it reminded me of my ancestors going, do you come in peace? And what work do you have here? I'm good. And then she slid into the water and away back to the pod she went. That was about 700-800 yards off from us. But you learn to listen, right? And it's, unfortunately, it's in the colonial mindset that starts to turn that into, well, I studied that in 1964. That means that they heard the vibrations of da 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 da. No, it wasn't. I knew exactly what that conversation I just had, right? So then it tries to get turned into a mysticism. It's not. It's a teaching. And it's learning how to actually pull that in, listen to it, put it into words, and then pass it down the generational line of these are the things that you need to know, because they might be important to you 200 years from now. So I think Indigenous people or people who've been struck by colonization will, all of us will resonate, because those are something, the removal of our identity, and that is still happening to this day. I know there's things I've said in this room and people will even internally, and I've got a great crowd here, even internally go, I don't know, right? But it's a perspective and one that most people will not understand until you've actually been in it.
Come back to the idea of the importance of listening. because I think that is so critical to listen and to see things differently. And building on what you've said, in 2017, I published my book Out of Concealment and shopped it around a couple of publishers, and all of them said, we don't do fantasy, not realizing that the supernatural beings that I was presenting are not something in the past, but are with us today. And my goal of creating that body of work was so that people could see that these supernatural beings are still in the ocean. They've become hills, they've become rocks, they've become points going out into the ocean. And if we can see those places on the land as supernatural beings, then we don't think of them as something that you can take. So in our way of thinking, there is a supernatural being that resides at the mouth of every river that we must pay respect to and give gifts to before we can take salmon or trout or the fish from the rivers. And that way of approaching the land and sea is forgotten, and I think is really important to remember, to shift our thinking. And I really believe that is part of our way out of the situation that we're in, is forgetting that. The elder one of the elders that I work with has said that the supernatural beings have not disappeared. They just, our ability to see through the curtain has become thicker because we're not seeing into the supernatural realm, but they're there with us and they're supporting us and they're cheering for us to be able to listen so that we can step forward.
I don't have anything to add, except I heard the same thing from 3 of my elders almost verbatim. The same words. They're sitting on the other side, but the fast world won't let us see them anymore. So they're waiting for us. So.
Well, I mean, we could probably just keep talking all afternoon, and I would certainly love that. I feel almost selfish in terms of like bringing this group together, you know, as a curator and as a PhD student. Like my mind has just been racing for the past, you know, hour and a half, like, you know, this sort of like making these connections and really shifting the way that I think and how that might figure into the work that I do. And so I just, I like have this like sort of like, oh man, like just so happy that you were all able to come and share. And I hope that it was as generative for our listeners as it was for me personally. And I just wanted to thank you all for really setting the table for the conversations that will come today and tomorrow. And again, just say hi, Zepka. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Renisa, as well, for really bringing in that nice sense of context and like broader sort of history that, you know, has really sort of shaped where we are today and the struggles that we're dealing with. And, you know, as Marianne was saying, like there, you know, like I feel like there's also this tension of the sort of depressing aspect that, you know, Morgan's identified in terms of like we're having the same conversation that, you know, 2 generations ago we're having, and how do we fix it, or how do we address this so that, you know, our generation, the next generation, doesn't have to have the same conversation over and over again. And I think it does really hinge on the sense of communication and translation and listening. And so, yeah, with that, I would just like to say thanks again, and thanks for people, our audience, for being here and listening. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the time. Thank you.